I do think that personal science is the missing piece that would allow algorithmic support of human reasoning to have widespread public health benefits. And I know that's a lot of jargon in one sentence, but
let's break it
I
down.
do think it's the missing piece. But I think that I don't have a ton of company in thinking that. The mainstream view is still that what artificial intelligence will do is find patterns in aggregate data, and it will get so good at finding those patterns that it will actually be able to segment groups into subgroups whose health outcomes are very predictable based on certain features or inputs, right?
Welcome back, everyone, to the Smarter Not Harder podcast, your home to 1 cent solutions to life's $64,000 questions. I'm your host today, Boomer Anderson, and today we're strapping in for a conversation around 1 cent solutions to areas like artificial intelligence, personal science or quantified self, and journalism. My guest today is Gary Wolf. Gary is a person who I've come to know for a very long time. He is the former digital editor of Wired magazine. He's a very accomplished journalist, being published in areas like the New York Times. He's a co-founder of the Quantified Self Institute, and so much more. So Gary and I talked a lot about the area of personal science, participant-led research, and some of the research studies which I had the great benefit of participating in, specifically as it relates to time series and cholesterol tracking. We get into artificial intelligence and the implications for personal science, and so much more. You can find those show notes to this one at homehope.org or transcriptions.com. And if you're listening to this on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, please go ahead and leave a 5-star rating. If you're watching this on YouTube, smash that like button before we get started. And now for my conversation with Gary Wolf. Gary, welcome to the show.
Good to see you.
It's been a while, and I've had the pleasure of interacting with you over the years in this field that we'll broadly call quantified self, and I have so many thanks to give to you in that movement for my own personal health. But Gary, I wanted to start with perhaps your earlier career, or it's still your career, but the thread that's kind of come through all of it, which is journalism, and or maybe you would qualify it as something else. But how did you decide at one point, like, hey, I want to get into this whole journalism field? Because I imagine it's challenging. I have so many questions on how to become a better writer, but let's start there. What prompted you when you were a young boy? You're a young man now, but what prompted you to get into that field?
Well, I came to California, to the Bay Area, to go to graduate school. And I actually thought that I would become an academic historian. So I've always loved, academic history, scholarship. And I still do, although, it's kind of like people who aspire to be a musician or whatever, and, they don't end up doing that, but they never lose in some part of their identity. For me, like, my secret identity is the person sitting in a library reading materials that nobody's looked at for a long time and trying to make sense of them. I just really I love that. I loved that then, and I found when I started my PhD that the institutional context wasn't right for me. I didn't have the patience really to do what was required, even though I still admire it. And so I took my MA, and at that time, the 90s phase of tech journalism was really taking off. And I'd always been interested in that. And I was sort of part of that scene on the side. And I ended up really falling into doing some profiles and interviews for a local weekly. And that brought me in contact with people who were starting Wired magazine at the very, very beginning. And that was a strong attractor. And so I was lucky enough to be at Wired during that first year. And we had a terrific time. I mean, I met Mark Andreessen, I think, within a month of him moving out to San Francisco to take his project from his academic work in Illinois into some kind of commercial product that they weren't even really that sure of at the time. And that was just one of the many fun and interesting things I got to do as a writer for Wired. And then some years later, when that all started, really there wasn't internet media yet,
Yeah.
not commercial internet media anyway. And so eventually, of course, Wired decided to take its publication onto the internet. And because I'd already written one book about internet culture and I was already at Wired, even though I really had no other qualifications, I ended up as the editorial lead for Wired Digital. And that was, of course, also a big adventure, a lot of fun. Most of that stuff that we worked on is gone now, but Wired News, which we started, is still publishing, thanks to really very smart and dedicated people who were there after me, rather than thanks to me. But I still feel a sense of pride about that. And, I did that for quite a long time. Um, but for me personally, it was as that was coming to an end that all this quantified self stuff began to take off. So it was really a direct transition from there into quantified self.
Well, you provided the perfect segue. I might, if we have time, come back to the writing component of it because there's so many questions that I have to ask somebody like you. But let's talk about that aha moment for quantified self, because I remember the early days of the ZO, and frankly, for me, it began with just like an Excel spreadsheet and tracking things. But how did you know that you had something in quantified self, in that idea? And take us through those sort of early days. What did that first aha moment all the way through to maybe the New York Times story? How did that look?
Yeah, I mean, I would love to claim that I saw it coming and really, or made it happen. And neither of those things are true. It really was an accidental discovery that was very satisfying, both socially and intellectually and professionally, but that fell into my lap in a way. I had taken a year out of writing for Wired, and I had a fellowship year at Stanford that gave me kind of a time to step back, think about what I wanted to do. It was a very challenging time for journalism. I was there with 12 other, I think, mid-career US journalists and probably an equal number of journalists from around the world. We had a year together. But during that year, or right around that time, the Hartford Courant went bankrupt, the San Francisco Chronicle went bankrupt, the Chicago Tribune went bankrupt, the LA Times went bankrupt or was sold. I don't remember which ones like officially went into bankruptcy, but a lot of people lost their jobs. I think 5 people out of the 12 US journalists at that time had a different job within a year or two. And it was challenging because what we thought we were there to do was kind of boost our skills and our foundation for the next phase of our journalistic career. Maybe take on some leadership roles, build some things in the world of journalism. And so much has come back so strong that it's hard to remember that there was a moment when it just seemed like, as a profession, this thing was in very deep trouble.
I remember like the New York Times was free online for a little while,
Yeah.
and it was dire straits. And this was, I think, before Carlos Slim even made his investment into the New York Times. It must have been wild. But
it was wild. I mean, it was really just like, especially because it was such a hairpin turn where these newspaper companies had felt like they were really doing well, and they had gone into expansion or had been sold, to investors or had brought in new investors, and then suddenly the bottom fell out, and so for me, it was okay. I wasn't a salaried employee of a newspaper, I was in a better position than some other very talented people, but it did make me ask, okay, what's coming next? What's an area of expertise, storytelling, news that I want to get to know? I'd done a decade on the technoculture, Silicon Valley, um, the internet, and I went for a walk with one of my colleagues and favorite people, Kevin Kelly, who was one of the founding editors of Wired, and we just did some editorial work together. We talked about the things that were happening that were not being as closely tracked. Right then, at that time, everybody was talking about social media and also about, people were smart and they saw what was coming about algorithmic influence in marketing and politics. These were all big themes, and those did turn out to be the big themes of the next decade. But I was thinking really about more intimate changes that technology was bringing. What happens when computing comes really close in to our bodies, even into our bodies, into our clothes? And, in talking with Kevin, I really just thought I wanted to write a story about that. And we were thinking, well, what's the headline? What's the name for what you're talking about? And I put the name on it, Quantified Self, which is really a synonym for personal computing. Quantified in some way means computing or computable, and the self obviously is a synonym for personal, but it switches because personal computing is like an industry term. It's a kind of computing, whereas quantified self is a question about who we are, as technology comes close to us. And so I kind of put a circle around these phenomenon, ubiquitous computing, location tracking, some of the community things that were going on. And I said, okay, quantified self, what's the story? And to develop the story, we decided to have a meeting where we invited people who we knew were doing interesting things on a personal level with technology. We had it at Kevin's studio, and uh, we were just about to start introductions, and somebody comes in at that point, and Kevin says, okay, you came in last, you go first. Introduce yourself. And instead of introducing himself in a normal way, he takes out his computer and he opens it and he shows us this detailed time diary of everything that he's done in the past year in 15-minute increments. So it was a way of expressing himself, representing himself through data. And of course, everybody was really interested, and other people started to show what they had been doing with their own data. And we had so much fun that we decided to do it again. And somebody actually was just visiting from New York, and Steve Dean, and he decided to bring one to New York and start it there. And so before we knew it, really, there were meetings happening all over the world where people were sharing how they learned about themselves with their own data. And, that was 2008. So that was 15 years ago, and we've been doing it ever since.
Gary, there's a particular format that you introduced there in that initial meeting where people are sharing experiments. But if I remember correctly, there's like a time constraint for how long you have to share your experiment. And that kind of carried through to most of the other meetups. Do you mind going into that a little bit? And I just want to put some context for people here who may have not been to an official QS event before.
Sure. I'll tell you how it works, and then I'll tell you why it works that way. It's really quite simple. The meetups are about what you can learn about yourself using your own data. So we ask people to actually answer 3 questions. What did you do? How did you do it? And what did you learn? And to speak in the first person. And if they're going to show slides, they don't have to show slides, but if they're going to show slides that represent your own data or your own process of getting that data. It's fine to show a slide of, the tool you used, or yourself doing the measurement, or anything that helps us understand your process. But don't show slides about, the future of the obesity crisis worldwide or something. Really try to stick to your own practice. That is pretty much universal. in all the meetings. Now, why? It actually wasn't like that at the start. We just invited people to write their name up on a whiteboard and say anything they wanted. And it was a lot of fun, but we were starting out in Silicon Valley, basically, where people are optimized to speak in a really authoritative way. I mean, literally, people are training themselves to sound like experts. And they want to tell big stories that are about changing the world and technology being at a turning point after which everything is going to be different. And often they have their own tool or their own method that they want everybody to use. That was so common that we didn't really feel like we'd be adding anything to the world if we allowed that to happen at the meetings. And it was happening more and more. And I would have to, as the convener, I would have to interrupt and say, that's super interesting. It would be great to hear about that sometime. But have you ever used this tool yourself? Have you ever collected any data about yourself? Let's find out about you. What have you learned? And after doing that, 24 times, we decided let's write down what the principles are of these meetings and really try to have people understand them at the very beginning, and and then we can have the meetings that we want. And it worked really well. People were really good sports. Even people who are used to doing elevator pitches kind of got with the program, and a culture was born.
This is absolutely beautiful. And I know over the years, you've probably seen hundreds, if not thousands, of different experiments be done. And I myself have run several and even presented some to the QS community. I would love to just hear for a second, Gary, for those who may be coming at Quantified Self either from a sort of nascent view or maybe just a unexperienced view, and give your perspective as to, and this could be from memory of like the best experiments that you've seen run. How are they structured, or how do you distinguish the good from the bad, if there is such thing as bad?
I have seen at least many hundreds. And I also am the community archivist. So I maintain our database of projects that people have presented that I might not have seen. So that has over 1,000 talks and presentations in it. And I have learned a lot about what works and what doesn't work. But it's from a particular perspective. What I care about when I look at a talk, listen to a talk, is, was the project meaningful to the person who did it? Was it worth the time and effort to them? Are they glad they did it? Did it advance their ability to think about themselves? And I think, did they share with us the process knowledge that they gained while doing the project? I don't care very much about whether I, quote unquote, believe the result or whether the result is, quote unquote, valid, because I've learned that what people assume to be validity or assume to be high quality in self-research is often kind of contaminated by other epistemological practices that in this context are kind of irrelevant. So I don't judge a project that I see based on whether I think it reached statistical significance or something like this. I judge it based on what it did for the person who did it and whether they learned something, some process knowledge that actually could be useful to me directly in my own self-tracking or to the people I know who are trying to solve self-tracking problems.
That last point is huge, because I think most of my interactions with the community, and I know we've interacted at various conferences, etc., have been as sort of watching on the sidelines and, of course, observing everybody else doing their experiments. And a lot of what I've gleaned is similar to what you just said, which is the process. Like, how did they set it up? How frequently were they testing? What were they testing? Those processes, and then being able to implement them in maybe tangential or even unrelated experiments. Those are the force multipliers that I've gained from QS myself. And Gary, can we talk about participant-led research? Because this was something that I was fortunate enough to participate in. And this is an experiment that I know you and Azure led, and I believe a few others as well. So I apologize if I'm not giving credit to everybody.
No, totally fine.
I'll make sure I'll give credit to them in the show notes. But take us through the cholesterol and triglyceride experiment that we ran a couple of years ago. If you don't mind, just take us through like how you set it up, how you came up with the original hypothesis, and what that all looked like. We'll get into the significance of it in a little bit, but I would love to just hear a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so just to give it some context, it's been very interesting to kind of feel a sense of responsibility and stewardship to this practice, which I know it's a mouthful, but it's the only way I found to describe it. I call it an epistemological practice because it's a way of making knowledge, and to feel like it deserves, it's kind of like a genre.
Mm-hmm.
They call it the Quantified Self movement, but it's not a movement in the sense of a political movement. It's a movement almost kind of more like an artistic or literary movement or something, where there's a set of things that people are doing and that they can learn from each other because they all care about some of the same issues. So I've had a sense of responsibility to this genre, to this epistemological practice. And in doing that, it's been on me sometimes to try to understand the distinction between self-research, which I now call personal science, because we really needed a name for it. It's not quantified self, because quantified self is the name of a community that it's not even my right to define what that community is, right? It's a group of people. That term has escaped into the wild, as it should. But when you really talk about what defines this genre, what defines this epistemological practice, can we do some really careful conceptual thinking? We needed a name for that. So I call it personal science. But it's been on me to explain, how is personal science different than clinical research or biomedical research, right? Or academic and scholarly work in psychology, say.
Mm-hmm.
And where's the border? And there was a time, actually that time still exists, but I don't pay as much attention to it anymore. But there was a time when I was really wondering about the role of people collecting their own data and the creation of generalized knowledge. And the conventional wisdom was that the way our self-research would contribute to mainstream academic clinical research was that we would contribute our data, and the data would be aggregated into these big data sets, and they would have a lot more context than researchers usually get, because people would be participating really enthusiastically and eagerly, and then the professionals would be able to look through it all and publish papers, and then we would be able to read the papers and learn something. But that stuff did not work very well. And we could get into that later, but it was really quite disappointing trying to participate as a data donor into conventional clinical and academic research. And so one of our colleagues, we have a group called the Personal Science Research Group, and one of our colleagues, Azure Grant, who was a PhD candidate at the time, she's now has her PhD, she and I talked about doing a small scale collaborative group research project where it wasn't about donating data, but it was about a group of people individually following a protocol that was quite similar and seeing if we got similar results. And the theory of knowledge making really here was, okay, you do it for yourself and you can get some confidence that your result is accurate, and it might be enough confidence for you.
Mm-hmm.
But if another person you know does it and they get similar results, you have a lot more confidence. And a number of people doing it really raises your confidence significantly, even if the data set never becomes the kind of data set that would be satisfactory to somebody trying to make a general conclusion about human biology. Although perhaps it would, right? I mean, in our case, perhaps we did.
Yeah.
We did show something. So we were looking around at our community at kind of who could support us, who had an interest in this topic. And we decided, look, we know that it's possible to measure blood cholesterol at home. And we know that this measure is typically taken only once a year in medical practice. We also know, or have good reason to believe, from animal studies and some human studies, kind of sparse, but suggestive human studies, that cholesterol varies a lot according to many factors, but including time of day. So we developed this question: does it really matter if you go into the doctor to have or the lab rather, to have your cholesterol measured at, say, 6:30 a.m. before you start work, or 8:30 a.m.? You might be fasting at both times, but it is at a different time of day. Your circadian cycle is different at a different place, And so we had such a beautiful, quantified self community where we could engage people in this question to do somewhat demanding self-tracking. And in the end, I think we had 22 people measuring their cholesterol as often as once an hour. So much, much more fine-grained measurement, temporally fine-grained measurement than in any study that we had seen over, a course of any length of time. And every person who did that project learned something interesting about themselves. But also we learned something interesting as a group, which was that I would have to go back and look at the paper. I think every person in the group showed variation in their cholesterol levels based on time of day alone. And that variation carried them across clinical risk categories. So that if you were trying to make a decision based on where your cholesterol levels fell, and didn't take time of day into account and didn't remeasure or average, you would potentially be making a mistake. Now, I want to say something about how this landed, how I think it landed in the world of clinical knowledge, because we were really happy with our result. We enjoyed doing the project a lot. We all learned something. Mm-hmm. I think its influence on how cholesterol measurement is taken clinically was zero, and is always going to be zero. I think we had zero. It was interesting for us,
Yeah.
but I think it only reinforced the gap between what we're doing and the kind of epistemological practice in clinical research.
Just one moment on that, Gary, because I don't know if I necessarily, I do in some ways. I want to disagree with you. Now,
Okay.
I want to disagree with you in the sense that that I would love to see that biological rhythms are taken into account when it comes to taking our laboratory data and implementing it in a clinical practice. I say I want to disagree with you, but you've obviously interacted with more people here than I have on this matter, and also the people that I've interacted with in this space haven't really adopted those views as well. So I'm sure you're right, but why do you think this is? Like, why is it so hard for people to just question or to say, like, do I need to retest? Should I be taking this at a different time of day? When we have things like glucose that we know has a huge temporal set to it, or in this case, cholesterol. So why do you think that's the case?
Well, Boomer, I love talking about this with you. It's very much in the weeds, you know, but I think it's fascinating.
Mm.
I do have some ideas about why, but I think it is an unsolved problem. I think that, well, let's talk about two things. One is, why does it not influence professional healthcare practice, medical practice?
Yeah.
And then let's talk about whether it's possible for self-research like this to have an influence on health practice more broadly, even if it is not influencing professional medical practice. So I've been very curious about why, well, especially in the past, I've kind of moved on, but there were a number of years where I was very curious about why this kind of small scale human research wasn't embraced. And we did some seminars. We had some really wonderful collaborators at the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation who supported us in trying to build an interface with clinical and public health research. And we met wonderful individuals and got pretty deeply involved and wrote some papers, you know, even so. It's not like we were approaching the problem from an oppositional perspective. You know, we really thought we could have an impact. I don't know for sure, but I'll give you two anecdotes that I think cast light on why we didn't. One is that I had a very good discussion once with a really senior researcher, public health researcher, also an MD, PI on a big project to do dense, you know, biometric measurement on many, many, many subjects. And I was looking for the ground of agreement between us. I was trying to find the most harmless, non-toxic proposal. And I said, well, I think we can at least agree that if you get a high blood pressure measurement in the doctor's office, you would be well advised to take some measurements at home and see how your blood pressure works before you get on a blood pressure lowering drug.
Yeah.
I thought this would be like the first step, right? And then we could get to much harder cases.
It just
right?
seems a little like that's the next. It seems logical.
Totally non-controversial.
Yeah.
How could anybody disagree with that? And he did disagree. And he disagreed in a very coherent way, which really made me think. He said, yes, I can see why that makes sense to you, but you are not thinking from a public health perspective. There actually is already good research that shows that if we give cholesterol lowering, if we give blood pressure lowering medication to everybody who gets a high blood pressure reading in the doctor's office, we are going to, on a population level, have a good effect on people's, you know, on cardiovascular events. Now, I didn't go back and look that up. I mean, I'm taking it on faith. Perhaps he was mistaken, but he's not the kind of person who would typically be mistaken about this. And he said, you know, if you want to say people should go home and measure their blood pressure at home before going on the drug, well, you should think about the potential harmful public health effects of saying that. And yes, we are doing a lot of research, and we may be able to show that people who go home and measure their blood pressure at home actually are in a group, you know, can kind of influence their blood pressure in such a way that it's not harmful to make that recommendation. But we're not there yet. So hold your horses. And I mean, I thought about that for months, really, right? It's a very good point in terms of its logic. And yet I still, for myself, measure my blood pressure at home, and I still tell anybody I love or like or who asks
Yeah.
that before you go on blood pressure lowering medication, you should consider doing a blood pressure measurement practice, you know? And I do think I have a solid answer to that, and it has to do with the fact that, well, once you start measuring your blood pressure at home, you start to become aware of what influences your blood pressure.
Yeah.
And you're able to make sometimes subtle or not very difficult changes in your life that result in lower blood pressure over time that will actually show up in the doctor's measurement eventually. So I think my answer is true. But have I committed myself to getting sure about that answer at a public health level? I haven't, and I'm never going to. So we're kind of at a dead end, right? Like until the research enterprise commits itself to understanding this, the benefits of self-reflection and reasoning as a kind of cultural practice at a wide scale, we're never going to have the public health knowledge that we need to recommend it securely. And I do think that that's something for other people to solve, right? But I think that's probably, you know, that's probably it. And then when you get down to the level of individual doctors, they want to know what the best practice is. They're busy, they're working hard, they got lots of different kinds of problems they're trying to solve. They just are waiting for the clinical research community to come out and say this is best practice, and then they'll advise. So we're probably not going to get there.
The third and I think final topic I wanted to talk to you about was artificial intelligence, but you actually just provided a very interesting segue there, which when we're talking about this commitment to understanding the data, and we're now in an age of large language models and generative AI, do you think that the artificial intelligence will actually support us in bringing these sort of N of one projects and this participant-led research, much like we did a number of years ago, to a state of public health, or to the people that make the decisions about public health in a way that would help them address this in a different fashion?
I do think that personal science is the missing piece that would allow algorithmic support of human reasoning to have widespread public health benefits. And I know that's a lot of jargon in one sentence, but
Let's break it
I
down.
do think it's the missing piece. But I think that I don't have a ton of company in thinking that. The mainstream view is still that what artificial intelligence will do is find patterns in aggregate data. And it will get so good at finding those patterns that it will actually be able to segment groups into um, into subgroups whose health outcomes are very predictable based on certain features or inputs, right? And so they'll be able to tell you you're this old, and you live in a certain place, and you have been diagnosed with this condition, and therefore, but these will be group level knowledge, right? This will be segmenting the population into finer and finer sets, and the ultimate vision is to basically get to a subset of one.
Mm-hmm.
So they will be able to use aggregate data to kind of actually model you, because really the way this vision of the world sees things, you are also an aggregate, right? You are an aggregate of a bunch of different features or qualities or inputs, and so so they'll be able to deal with you using that model. I think that the evidence that that's going to work is extremely sparse. It's conceptually coherent, but I think we're going to be waiting a very, very long time And one of the reasons we're going to be waiting a long time is that the actual detailed information about our daily life that would be necessary to make predictions on an individual daily kind of basis is very low quality once it gets aggregated into these big data sets. Um, Actually, these data sets don't know very much. And even at their best, they're hoovering up more and more data. So, okay, they're going to know our location at every moment. They're going to know our web searches. They're going to know even that data is actually very sparse compared to the things that we really want to know.
So,
So, yeah, go ahead.
Garrett, just one point here, and I don't know if they're still doing this, but take, for example, the nation Singapore, when they were encouraging everybody to get a Fitbit, right? And, we can say pluses, minuses of Fitbits, etc. But when you start to get, I guess my question here would be, could we design a wearable that would provide that data en masse that would allow us then go from this large data aggregate into something more bespoke recommendation for you? Or is that just, at this point, just too far out there?
I think it's too far out there. Now, I don't want to deny that there's going to be public health benefits to doing this, right? Like, I think you have to keep your mind clear and kind of, or keep in your mind a clear separation between society-wide, aggregated outcomes and individual outcomes. So, for instance, if you have a question like, say in Singapore, if you have a question like, if we make a national policy that wearing jackets is not required for business, right? That we want people in short sleeves, and all the government officials, and then you use your Fitbit data to show that when people took their jackets off, or when the policy was implemented, because you don't know if the person's wearing their jacket or not, right? But when the policy was implemented, on average, people took more steps. And your theory is, well, maybe they weren't as hot,
Yeah.
and they weren't wearing a jacket, so they were willing to walk up the stairs, right? Like that's potentially huge, right? That's great. Like, let's do that, right? Like, that's public health, thinking, and it's very, very important. However, taking that data and saying, Boomer, you set a goal for yourself of being more active this winter, and you didn't meet that goal. What do you need to help you meet that goal? What does the data tell me about why you didn't meet that goal? Does the data tell me, oh, well, maybe we'll get to the point where the data could say, well, Boomer has a 65% chance of having been depressed in the fall because we see that there's some depression signals. Where does that get, right? Think about that's
Yeah.
that would be a huge triumph. But like, where does that really get you in terms of meeting that goal? Oh, well, now we're algorithmically triggering a health coach to call you and to say, Boomer, you didn't meet your goal. I'm concerned you might be depressed. Just on a personal level, you as a person, how likely do you think that call from your algorithmically triggered, script following health coach, how likely do you think it is that that call is going to actually be the thing you needed to reach your goal? I think it's very unlikely.
Yeah. Okay.
So I see something else that we could do, which is that these large language models and what they say about the possibility for computing to support our reasoning, they could be used to help you ask the question, why didn't I meet my goal? And you have to come up with that idea, right? You need the skills and the training and the support and to be in the acculturation to think, hey, I should ask that goal myself.
Yeah.
Maybe you have a thought like, you know what? I've been doing school drop-offs in the morning, every morning. And this year school is starting for my kids, a half an hour earlier. I feel like this has really changed my life in a way that I didn't expect. It's a minor thing, but it feels like something that I'm going to try something, even though I like doing the drop off. I'm going to try doing something very, idiosyncratic, personal, never make it into a public health study. Okay, I'm going to do this carpool thing on Tuesdays, Wednesdays, Thursdays, whatever, something totally unique to you, right? And now I'm going to go back and I'm going to look at my activity data in 2 months. We'll do this for 8 weeks. We'll do this for 6 weeks. And then I'll ask myself, is it really worth it? I'm kind of missing the drop off. I used to like to do it, but did it have any effect? If it had no effect, I'm going to go back to doing the drop off again.
Mm.
But if it had effect, I might think about taking another step that could have a similar effect. Those small changes mean a lot in people's personal lives. But that little scenario I gave you, I'm going to compare my data on days that I did the drop off with days that I didn't do the drop off is actually much harder to put in front of yourself than people realize. I've helped and seen hundreds of people do projects like this, and I know it's harder than people think. Even with a Fitbit, right? I've got to export my data. I've got to identify the days in which I did the drop off and the days that I didn't do the drop off. I've got to make a histogram, which maybe I know how to make, maybe I don't know how to make. I've got to separate the days when actually I didn't wear my Fitbit, because that's going to change the average, right? And I have some 0 days in there. So each one of those steps of like doing your personal science project actually is potentially fatal barrier to getting to the end. And we are already using just ChatGPT, for instance, to help us kind of with this fine-grained process, just like people are using it to help them code. Now, it doesn't do that much good. I've used it myself, and I've been with people who are much more skilled than I am using it to code. They are not just cutting and pasting everything and counting on it to work, but they are using it, for instance, to like show them kind of an architecture that quickly that they would have to think about doing themselves. And then they look at it and they're like, I don't really like it. So they're getting this enhanced support with fine-grained computational processes from these AIs. And I think these are going to be really useful in personal science.
Gary, I know we're coming up on time here, and I'm going to save my questions on civic de-skilling for coffee, hopefully next week. But thank you so much for joining the podcast. There's a lot that we can take away from this, and I know I'm going to have to pin you down for a part 2 in the near future. But final question for you, Gary. If you can choose or give a recommendation to those listening for one tip to live smarter, not harder, what would it be?
The most useful tool in all quantified self projects, and I can say this without hesitation, is the project log. It's the meta log. It's the tracking of your tracking, right? It's the thing that you make a note and say, I started this today, or I stopped this today, or today it was different because. Even though the project log is not directly quantitative data, it's nonetheless the most important thing you can do. And sometimes it helps even before you get any quantitative data. So my one tip would be to find a time during the day. For some people, it's the morning. For some people, it's the evening. For some people, it's around a meal time, or while waiting, doing a pickup, or while waiting for public transportation, in which you put the date at the top of the page, you put the time, and you make 1 or 2 entries about what is different or interesting about today. As you get into like self-research, if you do get into it, those entries will become kind of specific, right? They'll be related to the question that you've asked and, something that you've changed. Maybe there'll even be a numerical value in there. But the habit of making that note at least once a day is guaranteed to have a benefit.
Beautiful. Gary, if people want to learn more about you, your work now, how would they keep up with you? Because I know you have many things going on all the time. What's the best way to find you?
The best way to actively engage is on the Quantified Self forum, because that's not just me, but it's a relatively small but really knowledgeable group of people doing self-research. And I'm also active there pretty much every day. And that's forum.quantifiedself.com.
Beautiful.
People are also welcome to get in touch with me. I'm Gary at quantifiedself.com. But often, if you get in touch with me about a self-tracking question or a tool question, I'll often say, would you post that on the forum? I'm glad to answer it, but I'd rather answer it in a place that other people can see too.
Gary, thank you so much for making the time. It's always a pleasure getting to speak, and I hope we can arrange coffee next week in your backyard. But thank you again.
Thank you so much for doing it, Boomer. I look forward to talking again if we can.
And to everybody listening, have a wonderful day. Well, that was another fascinating conversation on the Smarter, Not Harder podcast. I would be remiss if I didn't say thank you to Gary and the entire Quantified Self community for everything you've done in my own personal health journey. And so thank you guys. You've taught me a lot, whether it's your processes in your experiments or just giving me ideas for my own personal science experiments. It's meant a lot to me, and I really, really love the community. So thank you, Gary, for coming on the podcast. I'm sure, as you guys could tell, that this was probably the first of several conversations, or I hope of several recorded conversations. And if you enjoyed this episode, head on over to Apple Podcasts or Spotify, leave a 5-star rating and a review. Everything helps. Or if you're watching this on YouTube, just smash that like button, click subscribe, and we'll see you guys next time on the Smarter Not Harder podcast, your home to 1 cent solutions to life's $64,000 questions. Have a great day.